Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our weekly Safe Defend conversation. We need to say this: discussions with Doug. That's what we ought to call this.
I tried to get Jeff to jump in on this one today, but he had other things going on.
And other things, of course, Jeff Green, the founder of Safe Defend. But um, I know you and I were talking earlier about an article that recently came out about asking the question. And I guess it is the $1 million question: can gun violence be prevented? Is there anything we can do to make this not happen?
Yeah, so there was a very interesting article that came out in the New York Times. The name of the article is, title of the article is "We May Be Able to Prevent Some Mass Shootings." It was April 7th. And it was pretty much, they're talking about this book that came out from this guy named Follman, Follman, and it's Trigger Points. But what's interesting is that he's just talking about how there's been a lot that has happened in the last couple of years, but one of the things was that the FBI came out with this behavioral sciences unit several years ago, and that organization was able to, thwart by identifying likely perpetrators of a crime like this, of a mass incident or a school shooting, and they notified local police, and the next thing you know, we had a thwarted event, and those are the type of things that we're looking at, and so that's what we talk about is this whole behavioral threat assessment and what schools are doing to make sure that when something does happen, that they are taking the right measures. Let me caveat this whole thing saying that there's no clear indication. There's no, other than finding, say, the plans in a diary and a gun and all that sort of stuff. There are just sometimes when somebody has access to a school and it could be a spur of the moment. Most school shootings are planned out. They fantasize about them beforehand. But what's interesting is that we miss the signs of these all the times. I do a lot of training here across the Midwest, and I say, wouldn't it be great if school shootings were kind of like tornadoes? Next week it's not looking good for tornadoes, and 3 days beforehand the weather media is like, hey, watch out for Friday, and we have alarms that go off 12 hours or before, and if something does happen, we know to seek shelter and safety before the alarm ever happens. And I always get these nods of affirmation from people in the audience, the teachers and the staff, like, yeah, that would be great if we had that sort of warning. Be kind of like, well, not going to send my kids to school today. There's a 90% chance that something bad's going to happen. Well, the truth is that we do get all those signs. We just ignore them. We don't take them seriously. The whole NIMBY, not in my backyard type of incident. One of the biggest things we always hear is, I never thought this would happen here. That sort of mentality is driving this sort of overlooking of the type of crime or type of symptoms that are happening and signs that we should be looking at.
Because I just always speak to what I know, what my experience is. I think it's what most of us do. But locally or in our area, we'll see the news bulletin or be on social media. There was a threat written on the wall of the bathroom. There was this, there was that. You see it then. You'll see attendance drop 30-40% on that day, and luckily most times it was just somebody being foolish that wrote that. But it's an interesting thing. You always talk about the human element, right? And to your point, the signs are there. How do we recognize that? And if we do recognize it, what do we do with it? Why do you think people are? I mean, I know I never thought it would happen here, but do you think there's other reasons why people don't act on those gut feelings or those factual, the facts that are presented to say, hey, this is something that we need to be concerned about? Is it litigation? Is it they don't want to accuse somebody of something and then have it not be true? What do you think it is?
Well, some of it is that last thing that you just hit on, is this accusing somebody that might not be true. Kind of drawing a correlation a little bit about sort of inappropriate behavior that we sometimes see in teachers towards students, right? And then something happens and an arrest is made, and the rest of the staff is just shocked, like, oh my gosh, he was just such a nice teacher. The person was this or that. I never thought anything could happen like that. And what ends up happening is that there is this sort of there's this bias that occurs from the people that we interact with every day, and we don't think that people can be that evil, right? We just don't think that a student that sits in our classroom that we know is ever capable of something so horrific. We don't think a fellow teacher who's been teaching for 20 years could ever take advantage of a student like that. So we dismiss it based on that. Now, when it comes to the Boy Scouts or when it comes to something else, we'll clearly say those guys, yeah, I am. Right. It's that whole thing about the bias, is the proximity bias, and that the closer somebody is to you, the less likely you're going to see that evil. And so that's one of the key factors there, is just that idea that you have to break past that it can happen. That kids do snap, and that sometimes, unfortunately, horrible things happen. And so those are what we have to start to do, is break those biases and say, is there something that we should be doing with these signs? And, what's interesting, and we'll kind of run through a real quick thing on a behavioral threat assessment, but one of the key factors I would tell every school, that if you think that you have a student that has exhibited certain signs of misbehavior or a tendency towards some violence or something like that, it is so important that you have somebody else review that. And what I would strongly recommend is you just call the nearest school district to yours and say, hey, can we have one of your teachers just review, without knowing who this student is, just have them review everything we found. The stuff they wrote in their journal, the stuff, the incidents, the documents, the victim statements, the kid statements, the parents' information. Can we just have you look through it real quick and make sure that, we think this is something that can be handled with in-school suspension, and we don't think this is going any further, but we just want to make sure that this is not going to turn into something violent. And that's one of the biggest things, is that independent audit is how you break out of that cycle of bias we were just talking about.
Would you bring if you have a school resource officer, is that something you would involve them in that process, or no?
It really kind of, yes, you would on some level, because sometimes, school resource officers can't tell you, say, sometimes the past criminal history of that student, but if I asked you, if I said, Phil, could you do me a favor, make sure we want to handle it this way with this student, and we think that in-school suspension is the way to go. Would you do me a favor and just make sure we're on the right path here? What I'm basically asking you to do is go review his criminal history, which you cannot reveal to me, and make sure that there's nothing that's on there. And if I came back to you and just said, don't think that's the right path, what am I implying there is there's something I'm not allowed to know about and something I don't. But that's how you would involve that school resource officer. One of the things I want to protect, though, is I want to protect the integrity of the school resource officer program and understand that they're not really supposed to be involved in matters of discipline, because if you make them the persecutor, then they're no longer the protector of those students, and all of a sudden they're seen as, the students see them as somebody to avoid, not somebody to get close to.
Yeah, I can see that, and that's a fine line, man. That's tricky. I always say this. I think law enforcement gets put in some of the worst situations possible, literally, but also situationally, that we want them to do these things, but they can't really be involved here, and they can't really do this, and they can't really do that, and maybe that's part of the reason why we still have so many shootings.
Right.
I don't know. I'm just a dad, but it does beg the question. I know over the years that, of course, all my babies aren't babies anymore. Our youngest is a grown man, but over the years, it seems like the problems and the challenges. We've talked a lot about COVID and the restrictions, or the virtual, and just all the different stuff students and teachers and administrators have been through over the last few years. How big of a part in that, in the overall violent acts? Because it seems like they're upticking. Seems like.
Yeah, the statistics are alarming. Yeah. When you start even thinking, and understand that our school communities are a direct reflection of the community at large. So when you have South Carolina malls getting shut up, when you have New York subways getting shut up, when you have gang shootings in California, when you have parties getting shut up where students are getting killed, when you have shootings outside of school because of fights, when you have stabbings within schools, all of these things are going to bleed over and cross over, because the students don't separate sort of their student life from their at home life, right? The cultures bleed into each other. And so where you see the crime go up in one, you're going to see crime go up in the other.
And I think too, one thing is my wife's a retired educator now, but as as a man that was married to a career educator, and she worked with kids that had more needs than others most of her career. That was my biggest concern. Unfortunately, we know of a horrific event that occurred just in the last couple of weeks where a staff member was assaulted. And, horribly assaulted by a student. And I don't think
out in Oklahoma.
No, out in
Las Vegas. Yeah. Yes. So I was making sure we're talking about the same one.
Yeah. And and I sit there and I think we focus on the kids as we should be, but we need to realize, and this goes back to that thing we always talk about. Most active shooter situations that occur in schools are performed by people that should be in the building. Most violent acts, it's not like you're trying to keep a bad guy out. That's why I always, with all due respect to people that do this, I always roll my eyes a little bit when I see the little secure rooms and you go in and it's still intercoms, there's still human error. It's just, you're not, to me, we got to start dealing with the root cause of the problem and not just the surface stuff, right?
Right.
And that's training, that's knowledge, that's having a system, obviously, that if God forbid something does happen, you can get somebody there immediately. But I think the training is so important to help equip the staffs that, give them the tools they need to identify and to prevent and for prevention.
Well, one of the things that the training does do is that it brings the idea of this to the forefront, where people's teachers and staff, they start to see this as something they really do need to pay attention to. That's the worst thing is that we'll have our fire drills, but you're 30 times more likely to have a weapon incident than you're having a fire incident. And so if you're not training and drilling on how to handle a crisis, mental health crisis, or a violent event in your school, you're missing the boat because and again, it's the same thing. You're 60 times more likely than a tornado to have a violent event. And so you need to make sure that that's in the forefront of teachers' minds. And then when it's in the forefront, they start to think, this is something that could happen here and we need to take it seriously. One of the biggest issues we're talking about here is consequences, right? And schools need to understand, and I think we said this last week, is you cannot sit there and call the school resource officer and every time that you have a bad incident, at some point you become the mom that says, wait till your mother gets home. The kids are going to act outrageously because they know that the administration isn't going to do anything. And there are so many productive things that schools can do from, the biggest thing that I tell them is that you need to have a set of lockers right by the principal's office or the administrator's office. And if some student gets, put into some trouble, their locker gets moved to be that one right there, right? So now all of a sudden they're the ones that have the shame of showing up all the way into the principal's office and the principal checking in on them so that if their door's open, they can see these kids at their lockers. That's one of the things that they do. The other thing too is taking away of cell phone privileges. I've mentioned it before, but you just buy some little slots or little drawer, a little cabinet type thing that sits on top of the secretary's desk, and they check their phones into these different little lockers, or you have lock boxes somewhere. But those kids, that's a privilege to have your phone in the class, in school, and so take it away from them. So you're just not allowed to have it anymore. Being at school or being on property where they take lunch, those are the type of things that you can control that show that there's consequences to these actions. And what is interesting is if the school would start earlier, in the sense of if you have an incident where a kid says something inappropriate, then that is something that needs to be addressed. And you just make that kid check in at the front office every day for, say, just a week, right? 5 days of having to show up at school and walk to the principal's office and ask how you're doing is a clear sign of, I got in trouble and these are the consequences. I don't want to have to keep doing this. And those are the things that school administrators aren't doing.
I think, one thing that I smile because, as I say repeatedly on here, I'm old. It's just such a different world.
Right.
It's just such a different world. And I think it's important that my generation, I'm 55 or 56, I can never remember, but that my generation, what we would, it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. I'm not saying there were violent acts, there were, but it's the types of things that I'm saying, it just wasn't ever, it just didn't happen. And I don't understand. I think sometimes we're still trying to fight current problems with old resources, right? I think and that's a problem. I mean, I can tell you right now, if Coach Pitco or Coach Bowen or Coach Pask or Coach Powell or any of the coaches, all they have, the resource officers used to be the coaching staff, because if you were an athlete and you were acting like an idiot, they would take care of it,
right.
And there was they just would. And so there was this almost implied, it wasn't implied, it was general fear of consequence if you acted up in any way, not even something violent, but just weren't acting appropriate. And it seems like, and again, I don't know this, you tell me, but it seems like we've taken away control from the people inside the buildings, or there's an attempt to take away control. Because when you were mentioning move the lockers to the front by the principal, I think that's a brilliant idea. I think that's so smart. But the first thought I had was, well, some mom and dad would be mad because you're humiliating their baby and they got to walk to the office. And I'll probably offend somebody by saying this, but I think parents have become so soft that they don't want anybody discipline their child when they're acting like in a way they shouldn't be acting. Am I valid in those thoughts, or is that just me being an old guy that just doesn't understand?
No, I mean, they're totally valid, but that's one of the things too, is that this is where we go through that sort of restorative justice and getting in, and maybe you get the parents involved and say, look, it's either a suspension or this is the alternative. The alternative is turning in his phone, having a locker at the front of the, front does stuff. But then so the parents like, no, you can't punish my child like that. Like, okay, no problem. He's suspended for 3 days, right? I mean, and now all of a sudden it becomes the parent's obligation to figure out what their kid's going to be doing for 3 days and stuff like that. So,
well, there's so much cyberbullying that goes on,
right.
And I've often wondered, why don't districts just say cell phones aren't allowed in the building?
Because kids will carry them with them anyway, and then all of a sudden, it just gets down to 1,000 things that the school doesn't want to deal with, the number of contacts that they have to now deal with about, hey, I'm picking you up earlier, we have a dentist appointment, don't forget this, and so just like life is easier and all that. What's interesting is that cyberbullying. I do a presentation on that cyberbullying, and one of the things I talk about is, hey, did you have sort of social media posts and message boards when you were in high school?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called handwritten notes.
Right. No, yes, exactly. So that's what I love. I'm like, this is nothing new, right?
Yeah.
The social media post and the message boards were the bathroom stalls and the bathroom walls, right?
Yeah.
It got stuck in there, and if somebody's name got written on there, all of a sudden it spread around who put that on there, stuff like that. But like, it's nothing new that this bullying goes on and that people say things about each other.
Absolutely.
All of that's been going on. It just the manner in which it's happening has changed, and those are the type of things that schools have to understand. Is that like, it isn't that bullying hasn't occurred. It isn't that things aren't, new, that the idea of bullying is new. It's just that the means by which they can do it. And the other unfortunate situation is it's never ending, right? Like, you and I would walk away from school and the bullying ended. Now it's 24/7 and it's never ending. There's no reprieve from it, right? The kids that have been bullied, they're so compulsive. They wake up in the morning and they go to these message boards because they want to know what was said about them that, overnight. And that's the stuff.
The thought I had, I go back, if somebody wrote something I didn't like on a wall, or if they wrote a letter, you would go to the principal's office if you were a good kid. If you were an idiot like me, you would go confront them. But it seems like that with the technology today, it's not just inside the four walls of that building. The whole world sees it.
Right.
And I'm always amazed, unfortunately, suicide rates are very high with our kids that are continually touched with bullying. The statistics aren't lying. It happens.
It's not even that the whole world sees it. The whole world gets to participate in it too. So
that's the point. Yeah. That's the point I'm getting to, is that, everybody piles on, but also there's this component of it, Doug. All these adults see this. And I always ask my wife, why in the heck didn't somebody say something? Why didn't somebody, I don't expect a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old, or even, to be quite frank, a lot of 18-year-olds to know, hey, this is what I should do. This is wrong. But I sure expect adults to be able to look at that and go, hey, this isn't good. There's a problem here. I wonder if somebody is aware of this, that needs to be aware of it, and to initiate that phone call or to initiate that meeting or that communication. I mean, I can remember when I was young, there was a young man in my town. Him and I we weren't each other's jam. We just didn't like each other. And it kept boiling and boiling, and it had a couple little skirmishes. Well, the next thing I know, the two of us are sitting in a room with 4 adults, and those 4 adults are on the same page, and they just let us know, hey, this is going to stop right now, or your lives as you know it are over. And all of a sudden, miraculously, it stopped. Right? I mean, so it seems like we're not doing that.
Well, unfortunately, one sit down doesn't work anymore, right? So now all of a sudden, it's just one of those things where it is going to take follow up, and it is going to take some more action. I know we're kind of wrapping up, but one of the things I want to talk about is that you got to, and when I say this next thing, understand that one, it's anecdotal, and two is that the statistics on active shooters and schools and stuff like that when we only have 15 to 20 a year, and social media has changed so much in the last 10 years, it's hard to look at the 150 to 200 incidents and be able to say this is the pattern that's happening. But there is one specific pattern that kind of happens every year. And it's a tendency, it's not statistic, but I read it and the FBI is kind of hinting at it, is that older students tend to be the perpetrators of violence towards the end of the year. And it's about settling scores, especially seniors or juniors, going through and not, having 3 or 4 years of bad behavior or being treated poorly, and now they're going to settle those scores. Newer students have a tendency to do this violence sort of towards the beginning of the school year, because they go from freshman year, now all of a sudden they're a sophomore, and the bullying is still there, and they're like, I can't go through 3 more years of this, I'm done, and that's the type of thing that happens. So when you see these things, if you hear something, understand that from now, we're towards the end of April, towards the end of the school year, if you get instances or rumors of potential violence, please take it extremely seriously. Call those students in, find out where they're at in the building, make sure that you are looking into what they're going on. And if you have to pull them aside, don't just have a conversation with them. You need to call their parents and find out if there's guns at home, because the number one indicator of active shooter school violence is whether or not there are guns in the home, meaning access to a weapon. And so those are the type of things you got to look at. And then most importantly, make sure that you're looking through their notepads and their social media posts. Sit them down and say, here, log on, pull out your school computer and let's look through some of your social media posts together. Right there, right? If you schedule a time, they're going to delete the weird stuff. You should literally call them in, tell them to bring their computer and have them log in and go through it. Tell them why this is inappropriate. Tell them why it should be misconstrued, or it could be misconstrued. But it's so important that as we wrap up the school year, we're not thinking that we're at the finish line yet. Understand this is one of the most volatile times for violence.
Well, Doug, this is unfortunately the reason why organizations like SafeDefend exist, is that there's really no end in sight right now. And, I appreciate the work you guys do. And I really appreciate, I know you guys are working hard on a lot of really great training programs that are going to be good resources, great resources for educators, for administrators, for parents, for students, for everybody to learn more. So I appreciate you very much, my friend. Go have a beautiful weekend, and we'll talk to y'all next Friday.
Thanks again, everybody. Be safe out there.
Thanks, Doug.